Hi, this is a short video for you. It's a theme 1 topic 1.1.3 within the section entitled The Economic Problem. And the issue we're going to look at today is the distinction between renewable and non-renewable resources. So, non-renewable resources, they're resources that have been extracted from the earth that exist in limited supply, and they can't be easily replaced if they're used up. You could be even more exact here. You could argue that a non-renewable resource is one where the rate of consumption of that resource is greater than the rate of replacement of that resource. So if you take, for example, uranium, the demand for uranium's reasonably strong because of it being used as a raw material in the nuclear power industry. Apparently, due to processes, natural processes, every year radioactivity creates new bits of uranium. I don't understand the exact kind of physics process of it. As an economics student, you don't need to know either, but same with fossil fuels. Every year trees grow, trees die, trees get compressed, trees get turned into peat, peat gets compressed into coal, coal gets compressed into oil, oil gets compressed into natural gas. This process, though, is really, really slow. So the supply of new fossil fuels grows slowly over time, but not as fast as the rate at which they're currently being used. Therefore, you can argue that both uranium and fossil fuels are examples of non-renewable resources, because the rate at which they're being used is greater than the rate at which they're being replenished. So let's move on. Yeah, so as I say here, fossil fuels created from non-renewable resources are still the primary source of all the power generated in the world, don't tell Greta Thunberg, due to their affordability and high energy content. Obviously this is all assuming that life goes back to normal after COVID, speaking as I am in May 2020. Let's see. People like Thunberg, Bill Gates, globalists, they argue that we've been overly reliant on non-renewable resources, and the problem with those, especially fossil fuels, is that burning those non-renewable resources to create energy also generates pollution, CO2, which is going to, they say, definitely lead to climate change, rising sea levels, and it's going to reduce the living standards of future generations. Even if you look at Ghana produces gold. To get the gold out of the ground, you've got to mine it. The mining process creates pollution, and pollution damages these things called environmental goods. Environmental goods are aspects of nature that aren't bought and sold in conventional markets. However, nevertheless, they still give utility to ordinary people. So an example of an environmental good might be fresh air, or an unpolluted mountain lake that you get great pleasure from swimming in. So it's an aspect of nature. It doesn't belong to anybody in particular, and it doesn't have a market price. It's not bought and sold. Clean air isn't bought and sold. But even though it doesn't have a market price, it's still valuable. So economists would say that although there isn't a market price on environmental goods, it doesn't mean that we should be unconcerned about them and not take them into account in our decision making. So as I say, like the likes of Thunberg say we should go easy on non-renewable resources, because if we use more of our fair share of those resources, then the opportunity cost of that will be, firstly, there'll be fewer of those resources available for future generations to use. to enhance their living standards. And then secondly, if we overdose on those non-renewables, there's also the problem of pollution, which future generations will suffer from. So quite a topical issue. Non-renewable resources currently get a really bad rap. Is nuclear power generated from a non-renewable resource? Well, yeah, nuclear power is generated from a non-renewable resource. As I was just saying a few minutes ago, to generate nuclear energy, you need uranium. Yeah, okay, new uranium's created all the time, but that natural process of creating new bits of radioactive isotopes, it's really slow, way slower than the current rate of consumption. Therefore, it's a non-renewable resource. Okay, so let's look at another question. Have we achieved sustainable economic growth and economic development? Let's pin some of these terms down. So what's economic growth? Well, the economy grows when it produces more goods and services than it did the year before. Economic growth enables households to consume more goods and services. When we consume more goods and services, we experience more satisfaction, and economists, as you remember, use the word utility to describe the satisfaction that we get from consuming goods and services. So cutting to the chase here, what you can say is that by allowing the economy to produce more stuff, economic growth enhances the quality of life, because the more we can produce, the more we can consume, the more utility we all experience. However, it could be argued that much of the economic growth that we've achieved in recent years has been dependent on the exploitation of non-renewable resources, especially oil, gas, coal, fossil fuels essentially, that take ages to replenish, way slower than the current rate of consumption, hence they're non-renewable. So if you take that line of argument, you could put forward an assertion that our economic growth and indeed the development which is underpinned by that growth is unsustainable, because it's based on a precarious foundation, which is these non-renewable resources that are running out, and when we're using them, it's causing irreversible climate change. So some questions. Oh, let's look at the cartoon first. So this is, if you don't know this cartoon series, it's called Dilbert. I highly recommend it. So you've got Dilbert, who's the bloke with the bald head, and his co-worker, to use the Americanism, is saying, your generation is leaving my generation a dying planet and a crippling debt. And the middle-aged boomer, Dilbert, is laughing. I guess the joke is, so far, he's not bothered. He's just enjoying the nice quality of life based on these fossil fuels. Okay, so his co-worker says, but we shall invent life-extending drugs, so you will suffer along with us. So the assertion there is that the future is going to be terrible, because the economic growth model that we've been basing our economy around is it depends on these non-renewable resources. And then his co-worker says, we will connect you to machines and keep you alive until the poor demand to eat you. So yeah, so this is the apocalypse. You know, resources are going to run out, and in the future young people are going to be running around eating boomers who overused not just their generation's share of scarce, finite, non-renewable resources, but other generations too. And Dilbert says, well played. Okay, let's look at these questions then. Question 1. Many economists favour policies that are intended to create intergenerational equity. What do you think this phrase means? So what you could do here is pause the video, have a think about it, maybe get a pen and paper out, write something down. So have a go at that. Stop the video. Okay, so you've presumably you've done that. So here's what I would write: intergenerational equity. It describes a situation where there's fairness between the generations. So if the current generation is enjoying an improvement in its quality of life, if intergenerational equity is to be achieved, that mustn't be at the expense of future generations and their ability to enjoy a similarly high quality of life. Equity in economics just means fairness, so fairness between the generations. So that's what intergenerational equity means. It's an objective that governments have. There should be fairness between the generations. So then it would be unfair for the current generation to use more than its fair share of the planet's finite stock of fossil fuel, living the life of Riley, city breaks, multiple foreign holidays, 4-litre 4x4s, if the opportunity cost of that is felt primarily by future generations. Sustainable economic growth is growth that's achieved without compromising the ability of future generations to achieve similarly impressive rates of economic growth. So that's what sustainable growth means. So, last question. Explain 2 reasons why our economy is unlikely to deliver sustainable development in the near future. So if you take the kind of Thunberg opinion, which is passed off as fact, the first reason is fossil fuels are going to run out. Our growth model's based on non-renewable resources. So if our generation uses more of those resources, there'll be fewer resources available for future generations. So that's the first reason. And then the second reason relates to pollution. So if we overuse fossil fuels now, we'll be creating environmental damage. Allegedly, that environmental damage is irreversible, and it's going to reduce the quality of life for future generations who are going to have to live with all of that pollution that my generation created. This, of course, is assuming that human beings stop doing what they've always done, which is developing technological solutions to problems. As I said earlier, if Greta Thunberg had her way, we'd still all be living in caves rubbing sticks together. So moving on. Okay, so let's move on. Let's look at the other side of the coin, renewable resources. The opposite of non-renewable is renewable. So what does that mean? A renewable resource is a resource that doesn't run out. So solar, wind, wave and tidal power all have an endless supply. So they're called renewable resources. Again, to be more precise, you could say that the rate at which renewable resources are replenished is faster than the rate at which they're consumed. So economic growth and economic development that's based around the use of renewable resources is sustainable. We can create growth today without it compromising the ability of future generations to achieve similarly high rates of growth. Or as I say on the slide there, renewable resources means that the current generation can use those renewable resources and enjoy a high quality of life without compromising the ability of future generations to enjoy a similarly high quality of life. Really important. Economists believe that there should be intergenerational equity. We've talked about that a moment ago. So this is this phrase to describe this aspiration that there should be fairness between the generations. So if intergenerational equity is achieved, high living standards achieved and enjoyed by today's generation, they shouldn't be at the expense of future generations. So unlike oil, solar power, it doesn't cause pollution, which will damage the utility of future generations. Also, solar power is completely renewable in the sense that if the current generation uses solar power today to create growth, that will not mean that in the future there will be less solar power for future generations to use. So unlike coal and oil and natural gas, solar energy is renewable because using it today does not mean that there'll be any less of it for future generations to use. So, assess whether fish harvested from the ocean are an example of a renewable or a non-renewable resource. Even though I say so myself, I think that this is a good question. So maybe you should pause the video again and have a think about it. Like the best questions in economics, the answer is it depends. In this case, it depends on the rate at which fish are caught. So if there's overfishing, you could argue that fish are an example of a non-renewable resource. So if fish are caught and extracted from the sea at a faster rate at which they're naturally replenished by mummy and daddy fish, then you could argue that fish are a non-renewable resource. However, if fishing is done by small little boats like the one shown in the picture, you could argue that fish is probably a great example of a renewable resource, because the rate at which fish reproduce will be greater than the rate at which fish can be caught using small little boats. So the answer is it all depends on the type of fishing that we've got. Fish could be a renewable or they could be a non-renewable resource. It all depends. Give 3 examples of other renewable resources. So stop the video again, have a think. So wind, tidal power, solar power, those are your 3. So last slide, let's talk about environmental goods. I think this is a very useful concept. So I would make sure you know what environmental goods are and you can define them. So an environmental good, as I say here, is an aspect of nature that generates utility, which is this fancy word for satisfaction, pleasure. An example of an environmental good is clean air. Environmental goods are not bought and sold in a conventional market. Therefore, environmental goods are difficult for economists to value in money terms because there's no market prices for environmental goods. So clean air isn't bought and sold, so a market price doesn't exist. But that doesn't mean that they don't have any value. Of course they have value. There are many things in life that aren't bought and sold that are valuable nevertheless. And environmental goods are an example of one of those things. So pollution created by non-renewable resources damages the quality of environmental goods, which reduces society's non-material standard of living. And that's obviously bad for economic development. Economic development just being this catch-all phrase used by economists to describe the quality of life within a country.